Washington State is filled with small towns that seem peaceful at first glance. Quiet roads winding through pine forests, little communities tucked between mountains and rivers, and neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone. But beneath those calm exteriors are stories that locals still whisper about. Stories of a hillside that collapsed without warning and swallowed an entire neighborhood, of a healer in the woods whose patients wasted away under her care, of couples who vanished in the mountains and were found with a clue so strange it still haunts investigators, of a drifting truck driver whose secret letters revealed a far darker life than anyone imagined, and of a predator in eastern Washington who hunted his victims the way an animal stalks prey. Tonight, we're diving into 5 of Washington State's most disturbing true small-town horror stories, real events, real people, and real mysteries that have left scars on the communities they came from. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and hit the like button. It helps these stories reach more viewers and lets me keep making deep dive episodes just like this. And if you want a full standalone video on any one of these cases, tell me in the comments below. Now, let's begin with Steelhead Haven, the quiet riverside neighborhood that disappeared in a single devastating moment. There are disasters that arrive like thieves in the night, quiet, subtle, almost polite in the way they announce themselves. And then there are the disasters that do not whisper. They roar, they scream, they swallow everything in front of them without warning or mercy. The tragedy that struck the small Washington community of Oso in March of 2004 was one of those disasters. A moment in time when the earth itself seemed to rip open and decide that an entire neighborhood simply did not deserve to exist anymore. The town of Oso was not a place most people could find on a map. It wasn't a destination, a landmark, or a tourism stop. It was the kind of rural community where people waved when they passed each other on the road because everyone knew who everyone else was. A place where you recognized the hum of a neighbor's truck, where kids grew up wandering the forest lines, where the Stillaguamish River curved lazily through the valley like a ribbon of silver. The homes along Steelhead Drive were modest family places, quiet places, places people felt safe. On the morning of March 22, 2014, the sky was gray in the way Washington skies often are. Unremarkable, familiar. No storm was brewing, no earthquake shook the ground. There was nothing in the air that said anything unusual was about to happen. People were rinsing their breakfast dishes, folding laundry, checking their phones, making grocery lists. Children were playing. A few were still in pajamas. 10,037 a.m. Everything changed. A rumble began somewhere deep inside the slope across the river. A sound no one recognized at first. A low, groaning thunder that seemed to pulse from underground. Some described it as heavy machinery. Others thought it was an explosion. But before anyone had time to label it, the mountain itself let go. An entire section of hillside, more than 7 million cubic meters of earth, broke free and came crashing down with a force impossible to imagine unless you had seen it. Trees snapped like toothpicks. The ground liquefied beneath the sliding mass. The hillside didn't simply collapse. It surged. It gained speed. It accelerated. And then it crossed the Stillaguamish River in a single, monstrous sweep. What had been a quiet river valley became a tidal wave made not of water, but of earth. Homes along Steelhead Drive never stood a chance. The neighborhood was obliterated in less than a minute. Houses were reduced to splinters and fragments. Families were swallowed whole. A wall of mud, some stories high, erased the world they knew before they could even register that something was happening. Some victims were likely buried before their minds had time to form fear. There was no outrunning it, no climbing away, or no taking shelter. The mud wasn't simply dirt. It was a shifting mixture of clay, water, uprooted forest, broken homes, smashed vehicles, and debris compressed so tightly that rescuers would later describe it as being like wet concrete. And it didn't stop. Aye, doing a stop. It surged outward over an area of a full square mile. Even after the initial momentum faded, the valley remained drowned in a new landscape. a suffocating field of churned earth that smothered everything beneath it. For survivors who saw the aftermath from above, whether by helicopter or from the ridge, the sight looked unreal. As if a giant hand had taken a swipe across the land, as if someone had erased Steelhead Drive from the map. In the minutes immediately after the slide, the silence was eerie. Not because everything was gone, there were voices buried somewhere beneath the mass. Muffled cries, screams for help, faint pounding. For a short time, some were alive under the immense weight of the earth. Neighbors who hadn't been hit ran toward the sound, even though the ground was still unstable and shifting. They dug with bare hands, with broken boards, with whatever they could find. Some formed makeshift chains to pull survivors out of pockets of air. In those early minutes, it wasn't trained rescuers who made the difference. It was the people of Oso trying desperately to save each other. One man clawed through mud up to his chest to reach a trapped woman. Another pulled a stranger from a crushed truck cab. A retired firefighter used driftwood as a lever to pry someone free. Some rescues were successful, others were not. People could hear voices they couldn't reach, fading slowly as the mud compressed tighter and tighter. Within an hour, emergency services from surrounding counties began arriving, but the scene they found was like nothing they had ever trained for. Helicopters hovered above the disaster zone, searching for signs of movement. Rescue dogs maneuvered between mounds of debris. Crews waded through suctioning mud that threatened to pull them under like quicksand. Everything smelled of wet earth and broken wood. Everything was too quiet. 43 people lost their lives that day. Entire families, multiple generations, neighbors, children, retirees, young parents, and people who had lived in the valley for decades. The loss was staggering not only because of the number, but because of the way the community was structured. When one household disappeared, it wasn't just a name, it was a familiar face, someone you had waved to that morning, someone whose kids had grown up with yours, someone who always brought a dish to the potluck. The grief was not spread far. It was concentrated into a place so small that nearly everyone knew someone who was gone. But the horror of the Oso slide didn't end with the tragedy itself. What made the disaster linger in the minds of Washington residents, what truly made it disturbing, was what came afterward. Because as the community mourned, as the rescue effort transitioned to recovery, another story emerged, one far more unsettling. The slope that had collapsed had a long history of landslides. The danger had been documented. Studies existed, warnings existed. Some experts had even predicted that a catastrophic failure of that hillside was possible. But those warnings had not been enough. To many, it felt like a betrayal by nature, by history, by the systems that were supposed to protect people from known hazards. The idea that an entire community could be wiped out by something that had been foreseen in reports made the disaster feel less like a random act of nature and more like a nightmare of oversight, a slow-motion horror that had taken decades to culminate. It wasn't just that the ground gave way, it was that people had been living beneath a threat they couldn't see but had been documented in files and maps, files that most residents would never have known to look for. Files that would not have made sense to them even if they had. The more details emerged, the more the story shifted from natural terror to something more existential. How do you protect yourself from a danger you don't know exists? How do you trust the stability of the ground itself when the earth has proven it can betray you without warning? Recovery efforts lasted for months. The mud was so dense and deep that it took heavy machinery, carefully coordinated teams, search dogs, and painstaking excavation to find remains. Many recovery workers described the experience as emotionally overwhelming. The constant awareness that every scoop of soil might contain a person who had been living their life only minutes before the slide happened. There were stories of courage among the horror, people who risked their lives to save strangers, volunteers who worked until exhaustion, communities across Washington sending supplies, food, equipment, even letters of support to a town many had never heard of before. But even those stories couldn't overshadow the scale of what had been lost. Oso became more than a place. It became a reminder, sobering, heavy, unavoidable of how fragile human settlement can be when nature decides to move. A reminder that the ground beneath us is not as permanent as we believe, that the landscapes we trust can change in an instant. Many natural disasters leave behind ruins you can rebuild from. But the Oso landslide didn't leave a ruin, it left a void. A blank space where lives had been lived only minutes earlier. A wound carved into the earth that would take years to understand and generations to emotionally process. Some survivors rebuilt their lives elsewhere. Some stayed in the region but could never return to the valley. Others said they could still hear the sound of that morning, the roar that started as a whisper and became the loudest thing they had ever heard. When people talk about horror, they often think of monsters or villains or the supernatural. But sometimes the most terrifying thing is the simple truth that the world does not owe us safety. The hill across from your home can become a weapon. The ground itself can turn hostile. And the things you trust without thinking, land, river, earth, can change their nature in a single violent breath. The Oso mudslide remains one of the deadliest landslides in U.S. history. And while the story is tragic, it is its suddenness, its brutal, unannounced violence that makes it unforgettable. One moment, a neighborhood full of ordinary people living ordinary lives. The next moment, silence and devastation. A reminder that horror does not always creep. Sometimes it arrives all at once, carried not by malice, but by the indifferent power of nature. And in the quiet that followed, in the long days and nights afterward, the people of Oso had to confront the most unsettling truth of all, that what happened was not impossible. It was, in some ways, inevitable, a convergence of geology, rainfall, time, and circumstance. A tragedy written slowly into the land over decades, finally unleashed in a single minute. The earth moved. And the world those residents knew was gone. There are places in Washington state where the trees seem older than memory itself, forests so deep and so quiet they seem to swallow sound whole. And somewhere in that silence, tucked into the rural folds of Kitsap County, sits the small town of Olalla. Today, it is a scenic, tranquil place. But a century ago, Olalla was the setting for a horror so strange, so drawn out, and so quietly cruel that it still lingers in the imagination like a stain that never quite washes away. The story of Linda Hazzard does not begin with madness or murder, at least not in the way people typically imagine those things. It begins with belief. A belief so powerful that it consumed those who trusted her and left them reduced to shadows of themselves. Linda Hazzard called herself a doctor, though she had no medical degree. What she had instead was conviction, hard, immovable, absolute conviction that starvation could cure any illness known to mankind. And she sold that conviction with the charisma of a preacher and the intensity of a zealot. It is easy to look back now and wonder how anyone could have fallen for such a claim. But the early 1900s were an age of uncertainty, of medical quackery, of people desperate for miracle cures, because the real science of medicine had not yet reached the small towns and isolated homesteads of the Pacific Northwest. When someone spoke confidently, when they spoke with authority, people listened. And Linda Hazzard always spoke with authority. She opened her sanitarium in Olalla, a place she called Wilderness Heights. A name that sounded serene, almost healing, but among locals it quickly earned a different name, Starvation Heights. At first glance, Wilderness Heights looked like a retreat, a place to rest, to detox, to cleanse the body of impurities. Patients arrived with ailments ranging from headaches to digestive problems, from depression to chronic pain. They came hoping for transformation. Many believed in the growing health movement of fasting and detoxification. Others were wealthy spiritual seekers traveling from across the globe to experience Hazzard's so-called miracle cure. The cure was simple, terrifyingly simple. It was starvation, not metaphorical starvation, not dieting. Actual starvation, bread-thin bowls of watered-down broth, occasional servings of strained tomato juice, Hours of fasting broken by hours of more fasting. Patients grew weaker, and Hazzard called it progress. They stumbled, and she called it detoxification. They collapsed, and she called it purification. And when they died, she insisted they had simply been too sick to be saved. The bodies said otherwise. Neighbors began noticing that the patients who arrived at Wilderness Heights often looked healthy, hopeful, eager to be healed. But the ones who left, if they left at all, were gaunt, skeletal, barely recognizable as the same people who had walked in. Some left on stretchers, some left in coffins, many never left at all. And yet, unbelievably, new patients kept coming. Newspapers wrote articles about her. Health faddists praised her. She convinced wealthy clients that the agony they felt was the cure working, the toxins being purged, the sickness leaving their bodies. Pain was proof. Suffering was necessary. Starvation was the path to rebirth. And so, people submitted themselves to her treatment willingly, believing that the torment was temporary, that the hunger was good, that Linda Hazzard was guiding them toward health. But starvation does not forgive, and the human body, deprived of what it needs, does not heal. It shuts down. The most famous case, the one that ripped the veil off Hazzard's carefully crafted image, was that of Claire and Dorothea Williamson. Wealthy sisters from England, fragile in temperament and in body. They sought rejuvenation, spiritual nourishment, a new beginning. They found Linda Hazzard instead. The sisters arrived in Washington, already vulnerable, isolated, trusting, eager to believe, a confident healer. They began the fasting cure with optimism. They journaled about old emotional wounds they hoped to purge. They wrote letters home about spiritual peace. They told each other their suffering meant they were on the brink of miraculous improvement. But their bodies grew smaller, their steps slower, their thoughts confused. And then one day, Claire Williamson was dead. To death. Her sister Dorothea, barely alive, would later testify that she had been so weakened she couldn't think clearly, couldn't speak without trembling, couldn't even raise her head from the bed when Hazzard informed her that Claire had simply passed on. Hazzard even convinced Dorothea, in her feverish, half-conscious state, to sign over valuable assets and give the doctor control of finances. It was only because of a concerned family friend who arrived and found Dorothea nearly reduced to skin and bone that she survived long enough to escape Wilderness Heights. What shocked the world wasn't only the starvation itself, but the discovery that Linda Hazzard had been signing herself as the executor of her dead patients' estates. Jewelry, clothing, money, even property flowed from the starving hands of her victims into her own. The fasting cure, it turned out, fed someone very well, but it wasn't the patients. To understand why this story remains so deeply disturbing, you have to understand what Hazzard truly was. She wasn't a frenzied madwoman. She wasn't sloppy or chaotic. Everything about Wilderness Heights was organized, controlled, methodical. Her starved patients walked with her hand at their elbow. They depended on her. They trusted her. They believed suffering was part of the path to healing, and that belief was the most powerful weapon she wielded. Victims didn't run from her. They crawled toward her, and that is the most chilling thing of all. When authorities finally intervened, when the alarm was raised, when families demanded answers, when the trail of the dead grew too long to ignore, the investigation uncovered a pattern of death that painted a picture far more sinister than a misguided health practitioner. Bodies exhumed showed extreme emaciation. Personal belongings were missing. Legal documents had been altered in handwriting that resembled Hazzard's. Medical records, those few that existed, were vague, contradictory, or outright fabricated. In the courtroom, prosecutors described Wilderness Heights as a death trap disguised as a sanctuary. Witnesses spoke of patients wandering the grounds, hollow-eyed, barely able to stand. Survivors testified to the relentless hunger, the dizziness, the confusion, the way their minds began to deteriorate long before their bodies gave out. Starvation changes a person. Not just physically, it unravels the brain. It strips away will, decision-making, the ability to resist. What Hazzard practiced was not medicine. It was a kind of slow, ritualistic killing. She was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison, but she served only 2 years. 2 years for dozens of lives lost. And upon her release, unbelievably, she opened another clinic, this time in New Zealand. She returned to Olalla only later in life. You might imagine that once her crimes were made public, no one would trust her again. But belief is a strange thing. Some still followed her, even after the trial, even after the testimonies, even after the bodies. Some insisted she had been unfairly persecuted. Some claimed the patients were already on the brink of death when she met them. Some believed starvation was misunderstood by science, that Hazzard was a pioneer, a martyr of progress. It is easy to judge those people now, but fear, illness, and desperation make the mind vulnerable, and Hazzard knew exactly how to speak to that vulnerability. Her voice promised transformation, her treatment promised purity. Her methods were harsh, but she framed them as necessary pain-cleansing fire, spiritual rebirth. This is why the story of Linda Hazzard still unsettles those who hear it. It is not the kind of horror born from sudden violence or chaotic brutality. It is slow, almost peaceful. A horror that creeps in under the guise of help, disguised as compassion dressed in white. A horror that asks its victims to participate in their own destruction. Wilderness Heights eventually fell into ruin. The buildings decayed, the grounds overgrown. The forest reclaimed the place where so many had wasted away, but the stories did not disappear. Locals still talk about the shadows that linger in the trees, the feeling of unease that settles over the land, the way the silence feels too heavy as if it remembers. Some say they have seen figures moving between the trunks, thin as paper, drifting without sound. Some say they've heard faint moaning carried by the wind. Others claim the earth there feels colder, as though something was taken from it that will never return. But perhaps the most chilling part of the story came at the end of Linda Hazzard's own life. Even after everything she had done, everything she had preached, every life reduced to nothing by her hunger cure, she continued to believe in her method. She believed it so deeply, so absolutely, that she eventually tried to prove it one last time. She starved herself, and she died, not dramatically, not violently. She simply faded away, the same way she had made so many others fade away. She became her own final experiment, her own final victim. Some call it justice, others call it irony. But there is something darker there, something deeply unsettling she truly believed, all the way to the end. Her conviction was pure. Her faith in starvation was absolute. She did not see herself as a murderer. She saw herself as a healer. That is the kind of horror you cannot easily categorize. It is not madness. It is not evil in the way people usually imagine evil. It is something subtler, something eerily calm, a belief so strong it erases the boundary between help and harm. In Olalla, time has softened the landscape. New families live where the sanitarium once stood. Children play in yards that would have once overlooked starving patients wandering like ghosts. The forest has grown back thick and healthy. But the story remains, a whisper beneath the canopy, a reminder that not all monsters lurk in the dark. Some smile, some offer help, some promise healing, some speak softly, gently, confidently, and some convince you to destroy yourself while thanking them for the privilege. Wilderness Heights is gone, but the memory of what happened there has never really left Washington State. It lingers in the soil. It lingers in the air. It lingers in the quiet dread that comes when you realize the most terrifying thing in the world is often not the person who wants to harm you, but the one who convinces you they want to save you. There are crimes that end with the capture of a killer, the closing of a file, the tidy satisfaction of a case solved. And then there are crimes that linger, unsolved, unresolved, unsettling. Crimes that sit at the back of the mind like a whisper you can't quite hear but can't ever fully forget. Washington State has had its share of horrors, but few cold cases have ever left a shadow as long or as strange as the case known as the Tube Sock Murders. It began in 1985 when the small town of Mineral, Washington, a rural community tucked beneath the shadow of Mount Rainier, became the backdrop for a series of killings so bizarre, so chilling in their details, that the case remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in the Pacific Northwest. It started with a vacation, a trip meant to be peaceful, quiet, a simple escape from the rhythms of everyday life. Stephen Harkins and Ruth Cooper were not thrill seekers nor the type of people who made enemies. Stephen worked at a vocational school. Ruth was a waitress with a gentle reputation. They were ordinary people who wanted nothing more than a weekend of camping in Pierce County's wilderness, the kind of trip thousands of Washington residents take every summer. On August 12, 1985, they drove out to Tule Lake near Mineral. They picked a campsite, they set up a tent, they started their small retreat, and then they vanished. When their families didn't hear from them, worry began to creep in. Days passed with no sign, no call, no clue. Then, a group of campers stumbled onto a body inside a sleeping bag. It was Stephen. He had been shot in the head. His wallet was still on him. Nothing looked stolen. Nothing looked like a robbery. His body had simply been left there, zipped inside the sleeping bag like someone had attempted to hide him or preserve the scene. Ruth Cooper was still missing. For 2 months, her disappearance hung in the air like a question no one wanted the answer to. Until October, when her remains were found in the woods, she too had been shot. But it was the condition of her body that sent investigators down a path they could never fully explain. A tube sock, white, long, simple, had been tied tightly around her neck. The knot was deliberate. The placement was symbolic. It was either the work of someone deeply disturbed or someone sending a message only they understood. Investigators studied the scene, but the tube sock didn't align with the manner of death. Ruth had been shot. Strangulation was not the cause. The sock was an addition, a ritual, a signature. What made the discovery more disturbing was what happened next. The state of Washington is no stranger to wilderness disappearances or the occasional tragedy in its vast forested areas. But just as the Mineral case was drawing attention, another couple would vanish in almost identical circumstances. This time, it was Michael Riemer and Diana Robertson, a young couple with a 2-year-old daughter. They left their home on December 12, 1985, headed toward the same Pierce County wilderness where Stephen and Ruth had been found. Michael was a trapper. Diana helped with the work. They were familiar with the woods, comfortable in the terrain, not the sort of people easily caught off guard in the forest. The last people to see them alive remembered Michael giving someone directions. Diana sitting in the passenger seat, their toddler in the back. Nothing seemed unusual. Hours later, a strange discovery was made. Their truck was found near a trailhead. Inside the cab was a chilling note scrawled in pencil. 2 words, "I love you," but beneath them, written in a different tone, was another phrase, "Diana, I'm sorry." What that message meant, no one could say. Was it a confession, a plea, a red herring, something written under duress, or something planted by someone else? The child, 2 years old, confused, cold, and alone, was found wandering a department store in Spanaway hours later, abandoned but unharmed. No sign of her parents. And then, the discovery that tied everything together. Diana Robertson's body was found near a logging road. She had been stabbed repeatedly, brutally, and around her neck, another tube sock, tied the same way, knotted in the same fashion, placed with the same disturbing deliberation. But this time, there was something new. A second footprint at the scene, not Diana's, not the child's, a man's. Michael Riemer was missing. Was he another victim? A witness? A perpetrator? Or someone caught in a nightmare none of them understood? Investigators tried to piece the puzzle together. One possibility was that Riemer had killed Diana and fled into the wilderness, but that explanation always felt incomplete. Why abandon the truck? Why leave a 2-year-old alone? Why replicate the tube sock signature from the earlier Mineral killings? Why disappear for decades without a trace? Another possibility was that the killer of Stephen and Ruth had struck again, this time targeting Michael and Diana. That the tube sock was a marker, a calling card. But the killings were different, the weapons were different. The manner of death was different. The spacing between events was inconsistent. The choice of victims didn't follow a clear pattern. It was a horror story written without logic, without reason. For years, the case unfolded in fragments. Rumors spread. Speculation grew. Some believed a serial killer was stalking the forests of Pierce County. Others believed the cases were connected only by coincidence, an explanation most investigators privately doubted. The tube sock detail was too specific, too unusual, too unlikely to appear twice without meaning. But then the case grew cold. Witnesses died, leads dried up, evidence deteriorated. Wilderness erases things quickly. Memories fade. Time does what time always does. And then, in 2011, 26 years after the disappearance, hikers stumbled upon a skull deep in the wilderness outside Mineral. Nearby were bones, scattered by animals and decades of decay. Forensic testing confirmed what investigators had long suspected but could never prove. It was Michael Riermer. The discovery answered one question but created a dozen more. If Michael had killed Diana, why had he died in the same area? Why would he leave their child alive and alone? Why mirror the earlier murders? Why do nothing to cover his tracks? And if he had been murdered, if he was the fourth victim of the tube sock killer, then who was the killer? And why did the murders abruptly stop? The answers dissolved into the same silence Washington's forests hold so well. To understand why this case remains so disturbing, you have to understand what it represents: a pattern without a clear shape, a killer without a face, a ritual without meaning. The fear that something was stalking couples in remote areas, targeting them while they camped or worked or simply lived their lives near the trees. A killer who took nothing, demanded nothing, left no message except a sock tied around the throat of a victim who had already died of something else. That tube sock is the detail that haunts the imagination. Why that specific object? Why that placement? Why a strangulation gesture on victims who were shot or stabbed? Was it symbolic? Personal? A mockery? An attempt to confuse investigators? Or was it the killer's way of marking his victims the way a hunter marks trophies? The case forces you to confront a deeper, more frightening truth. Not all killers are motivated by reasons that make sense. Not all crimes can be understood. Some belong to the unknown parts of the human mind, places too dark to map. Some investigators believe the two couples were likely attacked spontaneously by someone who encountered them in the woods. Others believe the killer stalked them, waited for them, targeted them specifically. A few believe the killer might have been someone who lived near Mineral, familiar with the forest terrain and able to move through it unseen. But the timeline is strange, the spacing of events is strange, the signature is strange. Nothing about the tube sock murders fits neatly into the patterns of typical serial killers. There was no consistent victim type, no consistent method of killing, no sexually motivated behavior, no sign of robbery, no sign of prolonged control or torture. The only constant was that tube sock. For many, that detail is worse than a motive, because a motive, at least, can be understood. But a pattern with no explanation is like staring into a void. Your mind fills the vacuum with possibilities, none of them comforting. Local residents in Mineral remember the fear that hung over the town during that time. Parents warning their children not to play near the woods, couples canceling camping trips, hunters keeping closer to their groups. People looking over their shoulders on trails that had once felt peaceful. The forests of Washington are vast, rugged, quiet, inhumanly quiet, and it's easy to feel watched when you're alone among the trees. After the tube sock killings, that feeling was no longer just imagination. What makes the case even more chilling is that, to this day, no one knows whether the killer walked among the people of Mineral as a neighbor, a passerby, a hunter, someone they waved to at the gas station, someone who smiled, spoke kindly, and then vanished into the trees once the killings were done. Or perhaps the killer never left. Perhaps he became part of the landscape, buried in anonymity, swallowed by time, living out his life in silence while the memory of his crimes faded. Or perhaps he died, or moved, or simply stopped. Serial killers who stop are rare, but they exist. And they are the most feared type because they leave nothing behind. No trail, no slip-up, no confession. They simply vanish like smoke. For Washington investigators, the tube sock murders represent a wound that never healed. A case that continues to taunt them from the past. A story with no ending. And maybe that's what makes it so haunting. Because closure is a comfort, and this story offers none. Instead, it offers an image, a lonely patch of forest, a cold body on the ground, and a tube sock tied around a dead woman's throat, fluttering faintly in the mountain breeze. It offers a question, why? And it offers an answer that comes not from the evidence, not from the witnesses, not from the files, but from the darkness of the unknown. Some horrors do not reveal themselves. Some killers do not speak. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, and deep in the woods around Mineral, Washington, that mystery still waits. Untouched, unsolved, undisturbed. The silence of the forest protecting its secrets, just as it did in 1985. There are stories that fade, but this one lingers like the echo of footsteps on a cold trail long after the person who made them has disappeared into the trees forever. There is a particular kind of horror that settles in when you realize that evil is not always the shadow in the alley, the stranger lurking behind the trees, or the figure you cross the street to avoid. Sometimes, evil looks ordinary. Sometimes it moves quietly, politely, smiling when spoken to, blending into the background so smoothly that no one ever thinks to question it. And sometimes, that evil is 6 feet 7 inches tall, soft-spoken, polite, and driving an 18-wheeler up and down the highways of the Pacific Northwest. This is the story of the man who called himself the Happy Face Killer, Keith Hunter Jesperson, a name that still rattles law enforcement across Washington State, Oregon, California, and half the country. A name that should never have been forgotten, yet somehow disappeared behind the innocently drawn smiley faces he left at the bottom of letters bragging about murder. A name that should have been synonymous with brutality, manipulation, and cold-blooded violence, yet was so ordinary in life that people trusted him the moment they met him. Jesperson was a long-haul truck driver, a traveler by profession, a drifter by nature. He lived in the margins of American highways, the truck stops, the lonely stretches of asphalt, the hidden corners of rural towns. He was not rooted to any one place, which meant he belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. A perfect habitat for someone who wanted to kill without consequence. His early life reads like the blueprint of a storm forming. A childhood marked by cruelty, isolation, and escalating acts of violence toward animals. It's a pattern law enforcement has seen too many times, the early warning signs of a predator in the making. But no one followed the signs. No one intervened. Jesperson grew into his massive frame, into adulthood, into the world, and the world had no idea what was coming. He started killing in 1990. At least, that's the first confirmed murder. The real number has always been a subject of speculation, because Jesperson was not the kind of man who told the truth unless it suited him. He liked control. He liked power. He liked knowing things no one else knew. And he especially liked letting the world know how clever he believed he was. His first known victim was a woman named Tanja Bennett, Portland, Oregon, January 1990. Jesperson met her in a bar. She trusted him. Why wouldn't she? He was friendly, talkative, charming in a quiet way. But behind that calm exterior was a pressure cooker of anger and frustration that had been building for years. When he brought her back to a rental house, a fight broke out. One he engineered, one he fed, one he escalated. And when it was over, Bennett was dead. For most killers, the terror ends with the act. For Jesperson, it was only the beginning. He dumped her body off Old Columbia River Highway, left her, walked away, went back to his life. And then something strange happened. A woman falsely confessed. Not one person, not two, a couple. A couple. A dysfunctional pair caught up in their own spirals of abuse and manipulation. They said they killed Tonja Bennett. They described a fight. They described motive. They described crime scenes. They implicated each other. And police, desperate, pressured, eager for closure, accepted their confession. Jesperson watched this from a distance, watched innocent people take credit for his crime, watched law enforcement congratulate themselves, watched the justice system fail in spectacular fashion. And something twisted in his mind. He wanted recognition. He wanted credit. He wanted the world to know who had really committed the murder. And more importantly, he wanted the world to know he was not finished. He began writing anonymous letters, taunting the press, taunting the police. Letters signed not with a name, but with a smiley face, a happy face. A murderer branding himself with the symbol of cheerfulness. A killer marking death with the simplest, most childish expression of joy. It was mockery. It was performance. It was confession disguised as entertainment. And while investigators wasted time chasing shadows, Jesperson moved on. Quietly, methodically, without remorse, he killed women in Oregon, women in California, women in Washington, women he picked up at truck stops, women he met during long-haul routes, women who trusted him for a ride, for help, for company, women who disappeared into nameless anonymity the moment he put his hands around their necks. Strangulation was his method of choice. It was slow. It was personal. It required strength, and Jesperson had plenty. He often described killing as though it were a routine chore, something inevitable and mechanical. The way he talked about his crimes, cold, detached, as though recounting a long shift behind the wheel, revealed the monster he had always been inside. One of his Washington victims was found near the town of Washougal, her body dumped off a remote road. Another was found in the Spokane area. Some were never identified. Some may still be lying undiscovered in patches of forest along interstate corridors. Jesperson's freedom emboldened him. The smiley-faced letters became more elaborate, more mocking. He bragged about killings that police didn't even know had happened yet. The media tried to piece together the references. Detectives chased leads that evaporated the moment they touched them. And through it all, Jesperson remained invisible, the giant who blended in, the predator hiding in plain sight. Part of what makes the happy-face killer so disturbing is not the brutality of the murders, though they were brutal, but how long he got away with it. Years, hundreds of thousands of miles traveled, countless encounters, opportunities to be caught, but never caught. He was a killer in motion. And then, almost unbelievably, he got sloppy, not in the way of greed or arrogance, though he certainly had both, but in something as mundane as his personal life. Jesperson had a girlfriend for several years, a relationship he held together through charm and manipulation. But when the relationship deteriorated, the split became messy, emotional, chaotic. Arguments, accusations, turmoil. One day, during the breakup, Jesperson wrote a confession inside the walls of his own house, handwritten, damning, a rant of guilt and fear and confession, and then he painted over it, poorly, the words still visible beneath the paint. It was a moment of weakness, the only moment he would ever have. Shortly after, he killed again, a woman named Julie Winningham, his last known victim, a woman he had dated, a woman who trusted him. Her murder was not like the others. This one left clues. This one involved someone connected to him. Investigators finally began to see the pattern. The trail tightened. Jesperson felt the pressure. He panicked. And in the end, he did the one thing killers almost never do. He turned himself in. Sort of. He began by confessing to investigators, but in pieces. Half-truths, manipulations, statements designed to paint himself in the best possible light. Then he recanted. Then he confessed again. and he denied. Again and again, twisting the narrative like wire around a beam until no one knew where the truth stopped and the lies began. It became clear that Jesperson enjoyed the game more than the truth. He loved attention. He loved control. He loved knowing that law enforcement, journalists, and even other criminals were watching him, listening to him, trying to understand him. He was already sentenced to life, but still he bragged. Still he hinted at other victims. Still he claimed his total number was 8 or 12 or 50. The number changed depending on the day, the interviewer, his mood, and that is the darkest part of his legacy. He enjoyed the uncertainty. He enjoyed the not knowing. Keith Hunter Jesperson sits in prison today, but the unanswered questions remain. How many victims were there? How many bodies were never found? How many stories were erased before they began? And how many families never even learned what happened? The Happy Face Killer story is not like the neatly packaged tales of serial killers whose crimes are fully understood. Jesperson made sure his legacy would be chaotic, incomplete, fractured. He clouded the truth intentionally, leaving a fog where certainty should have been. He wanted a reputation larger than his crimes. He wanted myth. He wanted legend. He wanted infamy, painted in the cartoonish simplicity of a smiley face. But beneath that symbol lies the truth of what he really was. A predator who moved unseen through Washington, a manipulator who smiled when he lied, a murderer who took lives casually, impulsively, without hesitation or humanity. And perhaps the most chilling truth of all is this: for years he was not the monster in the dark. He was the friendly stranger offering a ride, the trucker chatting over coffee at a diner, the towering man helping someone load groceries. He was everywhere and nowhere, harmless and deadly, visible and invisible. The Happy Face Killer is disturbing not because of what he did, though what he did was horrific, but because of how easily he moved through the world without raising suspicion. Because of how many people trusted him. Because of how many victims stepped into his truck believing he was safe. A smiley face is meant to convey happiness, innocence, a moment of lightness in a complicated world. Jesperson twisted it into something grotesque, a symbol of confession, taunt, and victory, a symbol of death, a reminder that evil does not always arrive with a snarl. Sometimes it comes with a grin, a friendly voice, a calm demeanor, a drawn circle with 2 dots and a curved line. Sometimes horror smiles back at you, and by the time you realize what you're looking at, it's already too late. There are killers whose crimes defy comprehension. Killers whose brutality is so staggering, so far beyond the realm of ordinary evil, that words fail to capture what they truly were. And then there are killers like Jack Owen Spillman, predators so monstrous that even hardened investigators struggled to describe what they had seen. Spillman was known by a name whispered in courtrooms and police stations long after his arrest: the Werewolf Butcher. Not because he howled, not because he fancied himself a creature of legend, not because of some dramatic flourish carved into the aftermath of his crimes. The nickname was given because of the simple, horrifying truth about the man Jack Spillman hunted. He stalked, he watched, and when he killed, he did not kill like a man. He killed like something else entirely. Something that fed, something that consumed, something that saw human beings not as lives but as prey. To understand the full terror of what happened in eastern Washington in the mid-1990s, you must start with the place itself. East Wenatchee is a quiet community, an orchard-filled landscape of small neighborhoods and winding rural roads. People there prided themselves on safety, on knowing their neighbors, on trusting the rhythm of life that had remained unchanged for decades. It was not the kind of place where one expected to meet a monster. But Spillman didn't need a setting that encouraged suspicion. He created opportunity out of normalcy. He thrived in the spaces where people felt safest. He was a predator who wore normal life like camouflage. Even as a child, there were signs. He tortured animals. He dissected pets. He fantasized about violence in ways that teachers, neighbors, and acquaintances later described with a shudder. He once told someone he wished he could be a wolf, not metaphorically, not as a child playing pretend, but literally. He wanted to hunt women the way wolves hunted deer. He wanted to stalk them, tear them apart, devour them. It is one thing for a young boy to exhibit cruelty. It is another for him to build an identity around predation. By his teenage years, Spillman was breaking into homes, not to steal, not to vandalize, but to watch, to learn routines, to move silently through the most private spaces of strangers. He rifled through belongings. He lingered near sleeping bodies. He studied people the way killers study patterns. One investigator would later say, Spillman didn't fantasize about killing. He fantasized about being a creature that existed only to kill. When he became an adult, the transition from fantasy to reality was seamless. His criminal record grew: assault, burglary, indecent exposure, attempted abduction. But every time he was arrested, every time he was convicted, the punishment felt like a pause button rather than an ending. Prison only gave him more time to dream. By the time he was released in the 1990s, he had perfected the art of blending in. He kept to himself, worked odd jobs, drifted through Wenatchee's quiet streets like another man trying to get his life together. But beneath the surface, the hunger was growing. The violence began small: attempts, close calls, the kind of incidents police departments file away as isolated. But Spillman was escalating, and on April 14, 1995, he crossed a line from which there was no return. The first confirmed murders were discovered in a small, modest home belonging to the Kimmel family. Rita Kimmel was a mother in her mid-40s, hardworking, loving, ordinary in the best way. Her daughter, Mandy, was 15, a teenager with the whole world ahead of her. Smart, kind, bright. And then there was Amanda, 9 years old, too young to understand the existence of someone like Jack Spillman, too young to know that there were people in the world who saw her not as a child, but as prey. Spillman had been watching them. He knew their schedules. He knew their routines. He knew when the father left for work. He knew how the neighborhood moved during the day. He knew when no one would be there to intervene. He entered the home like a shadow slipping through a crack. What happened inside was so horrific that even investigators speak of it in fragments, refusing to recount some of the details. Spillman killed all three, but killing was only the beginning. He mutilated the bodies. He posed them. He did things that belonged to the darkest corners of human imagination. And he did it with the calmness of a predator fulfilling instinct. The crime scene shocked Wenatchee, shocked Washington, shocked investigators who had seen decades of violence. The brutality seemed impossible for one man to carry out alone. But Spillman was not ordinary. His size, his strength, his obsessive focus, his complete lack of empathy, all of it combined into something that moved through the Kimmel house like a nightmare given physical form. The community panicked. A murderer was loose in a place that rarely saw a violent crime. Mothers kept their children inside. Doors were locked in a town that rarely bothered locking them. Police flooded the area. Rumors circulated like wildfire. They said it had to be a ritual killing, a drug-related execution, the work of someone from outside the state. But monsters are often homegrown. Spillman inserted himself into the aftermath. He watched news reports. He listened to people talk. He visited stores where residents whispered about the murders. Investigators noticed him because he was too interested, too curious. He asked too many questions. He hovered on the edge of the investigation like a moth drawn to the flames it had created. But curiosity alone wasn't enough to arrest him. Then he made a mistake. Investigators discovered that Spillman had been stalking another woman before the murders, a woman who had recently reported a break-in. Her clothing had been disturbed, her belongings rearranged, a window tampered with. The police had fingerprints from the scene. Those prints matched Spillman. It wasn't proof of murder, but it was proof of obsession. Detectives brought him in. He lied. He smirked. He minimized. He explained away everything with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. But the investigators were watching him closely. They noticed inconsistencies. They noticed how his smile never reached his eyes. They noticed how calm he was when discussing the stabbings. And then, as investigators dug deeper, they found the link they needed, a trail of evidence connecting Spillman directly to the Kimmel murders. Please open. Fivers. Personal items. They arrested him, but the arrest wasn't the end. It was the beginning of understanding just what they had caught. Inside the interrogation room, Spillman began to unravel, not in panic, not in fear, but in revelation. He talked about death with fascination. He talked about women the way a hunter talks about wild game. He confessed to earlier murders. He described fantasies so grotesque and detailed that detectives had to stop him. When he spoke of the Kimmels, he spoke without remorse, without emotion, without hesitation. He spoke like a man describing a hobby. A prosecutor would later say, Spillman was as close to a wolf in human skin as I have ever encountered. His fantasies included wearing the bodies of victims like clothing, consuming flesh, becoming the predator he had always imagined himself to be. And though not all fantasies became reality, the ones that did were horrifying enough to cement his place among the most monstrous killers in Washington history. To the people of Wenatchee and East Wenatchee, the revelation was a violation, a betrayal of safety, a reminder that evil does not need a mask or a dramatic flourish to exist. Sometimes it lives quietly next door. Sometimes it waits, watches, and smiles as it picks out its next victim. Spillman pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even behind bars, he remained a subject of fear. Investigators revisited cold cases from the 1980s and early 1990s. They found patterns. They found similarities. They found echoes of Spillman's brutality in places he had been. Some cases may forever remain unproven, but the consensus among those who studied him is that the three Kimmels were not his only victims, only his most infamous. What makes Spillman so disturbing is not simply the violence. It is the way he saw the world, the way he saw people, the way he stripped humanity from his victims long before he struck them. He did not kill out of anger or impulse. He killed because it was the only time he felt powerful, the only time he felt alive, the only time the thing inside him, the thing he called the wolf, was satisfied. In the years since his arrest, the community has healed outwardly. Children have grown into adults. Houses have been renovated, neighborhoods have changed. But those who remember will never forget the fear that settled over Wenatchee like a thick fog, the long nights of wondering if the killer might strike again, the realization that the monster they were searching for had walked among them the entire time. Jack Owen Spillman is caged now, but the idea of him, the reality of what he was, remains. A human body, an animal's hunger, a predator's patience, a killer's mind, some killer's murder, Spillman hunted. And the difference between those two words is everything, because a murderer stops when the act is done. A hunter stops only when he is caught. For years, Spillman walked through the orchards, the quiet neighborhoods, the grocery stores, and the rural backroads of eastern Washington, waiting for the moment he could strike. He imagined himself part of a pack, though the only pack he belonged to was the one in his mind, a wolf pack made of fantasies and blood. And when he finally acted, the horror he unleashed left scars deep enough to shape the town for decades. There are criminals, there are killers, and then there are the ones who make you question what a human being is capable of becoming. Jack Owen Spillman was not a werewolf in the literal sense. He was something worse, because monsters of legend are fictional. He was real.